Good evening, everyone. So lovely to see you all here, and welcome. Welcome to those that are joining us here at the Opera House, and welcome to those that are joining our live stream this evening. Facebook tells me we've got 800 people that are coming to this event tonight, so if that's true, there might be a few people joining in online, which is great. My name is Morwenna Collett, and I'm the chair of the SAMAG committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations Australians with us here this evening. Tonight's a really important discussion about where to next following the Me Too campaign and what this means specifically in the context of the arts sector in Australia. I've got a couple of housekeeping things to speak to you about before I hand over to our incredible chair and panel. So it's great to see some new faces this evening. SAMAG is a small not-for-profit arts organisation run by a voluntary committee. We're really passionate about having deep conversations about important issues within the arts sector in Australia and internationally. We host a series of monthly seminar events, so if you haven't already done so, we encourage you to join up to our mailing list and also consider becoming a SAMAG member so that you can keep up to date with all of our different activity. Also encourage you tonight to join the conversation online via social media using our Twitter handle SAMAGSIT. This is our first event for 2018, and we're currently on the lookout for new partnerships and sponsorship opportunities to support our events throughout the rest of the year. So if this is something that's of interest, please come and have a chat to us afterwards. We've got some really cracker events coming up in the next 6 months. We're going to be talking about robots, about First Nations art, lockout laws, and even some finance hacks for the geeks among us. So I'd like to thank tonight's venue partner, the Sydney Opera House, for their generosity in hosting the conversation tonight, as well as all of our speakers, our facilitators, our scribes and our committee members. It feels like we've got a bit of a cast of thousands tonight, and I'd like to thank everyone for their time in making this event happen. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our chair this evening, my dear colleague and friend, Amy Maiden. Currently the General Manager of the Australian Theatre for Young People, Amy has national and international experience in the commercial and not-profit cultural sectors. She's done just about everything: producing, general management, domestic and international touring, commercial and non-profit ticketing and marketing, our favourite, strategic planning, and major fundraising campaigns. She brings a real passion for the development and showcasing of Australian stories to her work and is dedicated to furthering work that reflects the rich diversity of our nation. So please join me in welcoming Amy to the stage.
Thanks, Morwenna. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Amy, and it is my absolute privilege to be chairing what I think is a vitally important conversation this evening. I also want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any First Nations people joining us here tonight. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. A really big hello to our Facebook audience tonight. It's so great that the SAMAG team could arrange this event to be live streamed. The more people that we can connect on this matter, the better. So, where to start? It's our intention tonight to make this event an active, forward-facing, productive sharing of ideas around what is a very, very difficult conversation. If you're here tonight, in person or online, I'm going to wager that you have a working knowledge of the Me Too movement. So I'm not going to bother going back over the global events of the past few months. I will, however, say a few things to frame the night. You'll have noticed the title of this event is Disarming Sexism in the Arts, Me Too, but what next? And this is a very deliberate choice. We know that the Me Too movement has largely been about sexual assault and harassment. However, we feel very strongly that you can't really talk about sexual assault and harassment without talking about systemic sexism, and you can't talk about sexism without talking about power. And that is what this entire dialogue for me has really been about: power and the abuse of it. The Me Too movement has existed in one form or another for generations, but it's been in whispers. It's been in hushed conversations, in closed circles of women's business. It has remained underground and under the surface, bubbling up, labelled as gossip and rumour, silenced by fear of retribution, by bullying, by payoffs, and by defamation cases. But it came roaring out of the shadows in October of last year and has led us to this conversation tonight. But why us? Why the arts? Why do we, as an industry, need to have this conversation tonight? Well, a survey conducted by MEAA found that 48% of women and those who identify as female have experienced intimidation, abuse, or sexual harassment in our workplaces. 1 in 3 people do not feel comfortable to speak up about discrimination. Of our 8 major theatre companies, only 1 of them has a female artistic director, and all of them are white. We work long days, odd hours, most of us for lower than average pay, with a majority of artists jumping from job to job with little security or consistency of support. The teams at the helms of our shows are often tasked with creating moments of extreme vulnerability and heightened emotion in the rehearsal room and on stage. And I've heard many directors recently ask, is there a better way to do this and keep our workplaces safe? Our industry is set up in such a way that a small group of people hold a whole lot of power. And we need to ask ourselves, who are we giving that power to? How can we share that power in a more equitable and diverse way? What pathways are we creating to ensure that the next group of Australia's cultural leaders accurately reflect our population? I also want to acknowledge right up front that the lived experience expressed by the Me Too movement has not just been that of cisgendered women. This is something that also affects people who identify as women, by gay men. In fact, it's been experienced by a vast and varied group of people whose central factor of commonality is that they are in a place of less power than somebody else. And in our patriarchal society, I'm going to say it, it's pretty much everyone who's not a cisgendered straight white man. But, hear me out, just like any other major issue in our culture, marriage equality, reconciliation, climate change, there will be no long-term positive outcomes if this conversation calcifies into an us and them war of ideologies. If we really want positive, long-term, meaningful change, we need a listening, an understanding, and a coming together of people across cultures, race, gender, and generation. The Me Too conversation is a deeply personal one, on all sides. It is as emotional as it is exciting, it's as frightening as it is powerful, and it is at times as confusing as it is transformational. It's a big topic to tackle, but we are going to tackle it tonight. So, who is with me? No, I'm sorry, you're being live streamed and that was terrible. Who is with me? Right. So, here's how tonight's going to work. We have 4 incredible leaders of our industry with us, and each of them are going to offer a provocation around disarming sexism in the arts. They're all going to speak for about 10 minutes each, and at the end of which we collectively are going to break into 4 groups and take 20 minutes to workshop solutions, answers, strategies around their provocations. These 4 groups are facilitated by some of the most brilliant women in our industry, and they are, if you can give us a wave, Kelly Dolly, here she is, Bridget Van Leuven, there she is, Emily Collins, Judith Botel, here she is, and Ali Murphy-Oates. Yes. And at the end of that 20 minutes, we'll hear what each group came up with, and SAMAG are going to share those findings on their website and with the wider industry. As I said, tonight is all about working together to create positive change. So let's get to it. Our first speaker tonight is the incredible Lindy Hume. Lindy is one of Australia's most respected cultural leaders. She has been artistic director of West Australian Opera, Oz Opera, Victorian State Opera, Director of the Perth International Arts Festival, the Sydney Festival, Opera Queensland, and now Tasmania's 10 Days on the Island. Lindy is a recipient of an Australia Council Theatre Board Fellowship, an honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of WA, and a board member of Regional Arts New South Wales and NORPA. I am so excited that she made time to be here tonight. Please welcome Lindy Hume.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's a really good conversation to be having. And I would just like to point out that where I concur and where our voices align there, Amy, that in my conversation, it is certainly about the power that we're trying to share in our industry. There are a lot of grey areas, so I guess that's what I'm talking about, and certainly from my personal experience, I think that's the best way to go forward. I don't have any answers. We're going to try and work on some answers tonight, but definitely there are a lot of grey areas in this. Very few baddies and goodies. You know, it's not a black and white easy thing to codify. So I think I have two provocations to offer. I think I was invited here by Morwenna and Amy after talking at an AusCo leadership event in Hobart, and we were all supposed to share our wisdom on the cultural solutions for the big issues of our time in about 5 minutes each, which of course was impossible. So instead, again, taking the personal as the universal, I shared with the group a much more personal story, and particularly in the fact that in the middle of last year I experienced a pretty bad episode of depression that lasted several months, and underpinning this depression was the sense that, and I know I'm not alone in this, that the world was sort of going to hell in a handbasket, and that as a woman and an artist, there was very little I could do about it. Then the election of Donald Trump at the end of 2016 absolutely rocked me to my core. It just seemed all so bleak, and I was overwhelmed and fragile and teary, and none of which I am by nature. And then I realised I wasn't alone in this experience, and I've been doing quite a lot of reading on this. There's actually actual syndromes now around this sense of depression and hopelessness to do with these feelings. There's millions of others, and many, many women have been equally traumatised by the sexism, the racism, the lies, the misogyny, the dumbing down, the xenophobia endorsed by this particular prevailing patriarchy. We are part of a very large global community saying that these behaviours are not acceptable. And so emerging from the tunnel back into the light of these last few months, I realised that for me, embracing a stronger, more active role as a citizen in my community, both local community, national community, global community, was one of the things that eventually pulled me out of my blues, alongside a lot of yoga, some good friends, and some excellent antidepressants. So in the spirit of community and citizenship, I want to add my voice to the important discussion on sexism in our industry. I am in a really unusual position of having spent a decade and a half as one of only two, count them two, artistic directors of the 28 major performing arts companies, which is a national disgrace, and it has been going on for far too long, literally as long as I've been an artistic director of a major. I'm not anymore, but I've always been one of two, at the most 2.5, when Kate Blanchett was half of the Sydney Theatre Company. I was the first female artistic director of the Perth Festival and the Sydney Festival, and the first artistic director of all 4 opera companies that I've worked for. And so I've certainly experienced the effects, both systemic and informal, of sexism in my life and career. Very often I felt like some kind of a unicorn, being one of very few. So it's a relief that in my most recent job at 10 Days on the Island, most of my predecessors have been women. And I've been incredibly encouraged by the Me Too movement, the global surge of support for women taking back their power and calling out sexism, which has oppressed and defined us professionally for far too long has made me very optimistic and confident that real change is actually happening. And actually, to be just to one side, the optimism and confidence maybe suggests that something similar can happen with the gun lobby. Let's all cross our fingers. But this has also made me have a long, hard look at myself and why it's been so hard for so many women who aspire to artistic leadership at that sort of major festival, major organisation level, have that same kind of career that I've been lucky enough to have. Why that's been so hard. And look, sure, I've had some really fortunate breaks, which I've backed up with talent and focus and bloody hard work. I'm certainly not going to say I don't deserve those amazing jobs. I think I do. But was there something I had done differently? Was there some sort of secret formula that I could share with my colleagues? And through this self-analysis, a very uncomfortable truth has dawned upon me. So to my first provocation, to my shame, I realise that I have not only internalised, minimised and normalised the sexism that I've experienced, but that over the years I've allowed it to dull my edge, to blunt my tools, and I've learnt to tone myself down from the firebrand young feminist I was in my 30s when I created my controversial feminist Carmen 25 years ago. I think probably the reality is to make myself more user-friendly or employable in the corporate political boardroom environment that I found myself in as artistic director of these major companies, major festivals and arts companies. Have I been complicit in perpetuating, or at least playing to, the patriarchal system? It boils down to this. As an artist, and I am both, as an artist, as a director, I have been freer to use my feminist voice, but to survive as an artistic director for this long, I've learnt in certain circumstances when to shut up, when to compromise, when to be diplomatic, how to stroke egos, to toe the party line. I've sat silently wincing at boring, boorish, blokey boardroom behaviour. I have taken the path of least resistance. I've patiently ignored sighs and eye-rolling and mansplaining. I've been patronised by board members, not only men, mind you, and all these people are not bad people. A lot of them are friends and really good people. I've been told when I put on weight or I look nicer when I'm wearing lipstick, and I've been told many times not to be over-emotional or over-dramatic. I'm over it. It's not going to happen anymore. But I thought, and I still think, it was worth it. I still believe I fought the good fight. I've given more women great career and role opportunities. My productions have been always viewed through a feminist prism. I show strong, funny, powerful women on stage, and I do all that I can to subvert the stereotypical misogyny of opera. I wrote an article in The Guardian last year which got howled down by most of the male comments, where I said, despite a large female audience, opera is controlled largely by middle-aged blokes who commission other blokes to direct, conduct and design operas composed by dead white men. Some of my favourite composers are dead white men, but the world has changed. There are countless excellent women composers, conductors, directors, set designers and more. There are no excuses for the industry's casual bias. So I talk about also the misogyny and cruelty embedded in the opera repertoire, opera narratives of rape, murder, abuse and stereotypes from good girls and bad girls. They go unquestioned increasingly by creative teams, and I've lost count of the number of times that female performers have told me that they love being directed by a woman who can empathise with a female perspective on a role. So there are complicated things within the opera and I think the ballet paradigm, but showing a complex woman on the opera stage and the ballet stage can still be seen as radical, which is incredible. And that gender imbalance in opera doesn't just affect the careers of female artists, it has a very profound impact on the contemporary audience's response. So I think, look, the statistics show that women creatives are horribly underrepresented in opera, not just here in Australia but elsewhere in the world. It's much worse, in fact, in the UK and the USA, for example. So those are some of the issues in relating to opera and the majors, and this next one is a little shorter, sorry. The second provocation was slightly sideways in relation to sexism, and this is something that I struggle with as an artist, as a director. Emotional messiness and sexual energy is part of the creative process. As a director of opera, it's really not unusual for me to be directing material well beyond my comfort zone and in dangerous emotional and psychological territory. 2 operas that I'm directing this year, Carmen and Don Giovanni, deal with complex and very extreme scenarios. For example, lots of sexually charged scenes, one character repeatedly overpowering another, sometimes violently, sometimes psychologically, but always cruelly. Violence, brutality, psychopathic behaviour, rape and murder, moral decay, black humour while engaging in the above, and above all, and this is where it gets really tricky, mind games. And it's really, in my experience, impossible to enter those worlds with highly intelligent and experienced artists without giving those artists permission or urging them to push the boundaries of socially accepted behaviour, even encouraging people out of their comfort zones to test each other's appetite for emotional danger. And if I don't create that space for emotional danger, I'm not doing my job. This stuff is just messy. It pushes buttons, it collides with real life, and it always has and it always will, and that's kind of the point to it. And in a weird way, same is true of directing comedy, where the room has to be fast and flirty and romantic and naughty and almost risque and outrageous and anarchic and sexy as hell. And then add to that what's at stake emotionally for the artists in the room: loneliness, fear. Show me a rehearsal process that doesn't involve tears at some point. Sexual and intellectual attraction, hypersensitivity, anxiety, vulnerability, the histories of people, self-image. So I guess that's the second propagation: emotional messiness, chaos, sexual energy, the exercise of all kinds of power, and the spaces in between are all part of that creative process. They're part of the landscape we venture through, and how we navigate that messiness seems increasingly fraught in an environment of hypervigilance. I know my job as a director is calibrating these things day to day, intuitively and with empathy, and as an artistic director, I have my duty of care to make the rehearsal room safe. But I worry about creating a highly regulated room that isn't buzzing with human emotion and complexity, or where people are frightened to take emotional risks. That's a very boring rehearsal room indeed, and it probably won't produce good art. So finally, I guess one of the things that I've discovered in this process, that I find there's a tension, a discomfort between the roles and responsibilities of the director as artist and the artistic director in those 2 provocation scenarios. And I'm still puzzling through the implications on the work that we present to our audiences of that tension. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. It's just not a straight line, is it? Nothing about this is simple, which is why it's such a mess. Okay, so next up, we have Michael Brearley. Michael is the CEO of Create New South Wales, the New South Wales Office of Arts, Screen and Culture. Michael is responsible for strategic leadership and investment across the screen, arts and cultural cluster, including collaboration with New South Wales cultural institutions and industry stakeholders across screen and arts. Prior to Create New South Wales, Michael was the head of policy, strategy and governance for the ABC TV, the manager of public policy and content standards for Vodafone Australia, and he's held various roles in the Department of Communications, Information Technology and the Arts. Michael's also a father, and his team have told me that he rarely takes up invitations to evenings such as these, as he likes to make sure he's spending time with his family. So we are very lucky to have him here tonight, and I always love listening to Michael speak. So please, without further ado, welcome Michael Brearley.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. So my provocation, or rather what I wanted to talk to, was what agencies like ours, which inherently have a lot of influence and power because we hand out money, can do to try and address sexism in the arts. More broadly, though, for me, it's also about what we can do to encourage opportunity, to encourage diversity. And I mentioned diversity more broadly because, as Amy said to begin with, this is about power. And for me, I think introducing more diversity into both workplace, opportunity for careers and audiences is about redistribution of power. It's about not just redistribution of power, but addressing where the focus of power lies. So, and if in any organisation you have a particular group, say for example, a group of straight white men like me, talking together about the same sorts of things, then their prejudices are going to build upon one another. It's just kind of natural that you have the same kinds of conversations. So I think breaking down or introducing more diversity into both workplaces and the sorts of opportunities that we provide as a funding agency are kind of fundamental to breaking down the bedrock of what sexism in the arts has built. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things, and forgive me, it's a bit dry, not nearly as exciting, but things like codes of conduct, which we are seeing AusCo and Screen Australia introduce, in particularly individual organisations like A2IP. Broadly speaking, governance frameworks, career pathways, things like targets and reporting. This is something I'll draw on from our experience in the screen sector. So codes of conduct, as I said, AusCo, Screen Australia in particular is saying if you want to get funding from us, you need to introduce a code of conduct. So code of conduct is great in that it sets an expectation about behaviour and it provides a pathway to deal with inappropriate behaviour. But I think there's obviously a lot more than that that's required, because we are dealing with power structures in an industry where if you raise your voice as a woman who is with a particular power structure in place, you're going to be afraid, rightly so, you will be afraid that that's the end of your career or never work again, or you'll be penalised in some way, shape or form, which leads me to governance structures, because I think the onus is on organisations, particularly boards of organisations and the sorts of organisations we fund, to have very broad governance structures in place and frameworks that not only have guidelines for staff, appropriate behaviour, frameworks for response, but create an atmosphere where, not just an atmosphere, a very real situation where it is safe for people to raise their complaint, to make it clear that they've been treated unfairly and to know that they can do that without repercussion. There are a lot of organisations that are just out of good governance doing these sorts of things now, but you'd be surprised at some of the big organisations that just haven't yet, and which are beginning to go down that journey. And so as a government agency, part of what we can do, the same with codes of conduct and Screen Australia example, I suppose, is to work with those organisations to make sure they adopt best practice, that they understand that this is something that is expected of them as an organisation that receives funding from government, and to ensure that they follow through on that. In terms of career pathways, you mentioned the artistic directors example, and it's a really good one. So you could take one approach would be to say, if you're going to be funded by us, then you're going to have fixed-term contracts and you're going to change out your artistic director every 3 years. Now, we're treading the line there as a government agency between really interceding in the business of these organisations that we fund and their independence, and ensuring good governance outcomes. So I think another opportunity, and perhaps it's a graduated way of dealing with it, is that you introduce more opportunity. So we saw it in the screen sector, and Screen New South Wales, Courtney Gibson, who preceded me as Screen New South Wales, introduced a really great range of measures to deal with sexism in the screen industry. Now, we don't pretend that that has fixed the industry in Australia, because of course it hasn't, but it's been really proactive and it's been very well received by industry to a large extent. People have really got on board. And that's about placements, paid placements, and it's about targets. And by targets, we're establishing for industry what our expectation is. And then we're having conversations with individual producers about what is the makeup of your team, the key creatives, how many men, how many women, have you thought about talking to this person? And if you come back to us with a much more diverse creative team, you're more likely to get funded. Now, that doesn't mean we don't fund organisations or projects, rather, that come to us with all-male creative teams, but it does mean that we have a higher proportion of all-female creative teams that we're funding as well. The thing with placements is that you begin to break down a prejudice about who you employ, and it's not just men employing men, but that does happen a lot of the time. You know, a good example I was talking about earlier, we had a producer, female producer, come back to us only a couple of weeks ago to say, thank you so much for pushing me to bring on board that female editor, because I know I wanted to have this other person that I've known for years and happened to be a bloke, but she's fantastic. We've used her on 4 other productions. You know, so it's about opportunity for individuals, but also, those organisations understanding that they're probably cutting their nose off despite their face by not giving other people an opportunity. I mean, the PwC media report last year said a lack of diversity in the media industry is inhibiting growth. Start talk about it in those terms with some of these organisations, then you start talking about the bottom line, and you have another lever for making change happen. The same goes in the workplace. You know, you do placements. Over time, we're building up a higher proportion of women in those roles, and you change the conversation. It's not just the same sorts of people talking to the same sorts of people, not just necessarily white men. You're also then talking about a change in output. One thing that we're really keen on is in making sure that the content that we fund is more representative of the whole of New South Wales and everyone in New South Wales. If all your content is predominantly about white people, then you don't see yourself either on the screen or on the stage or in the work, and then it's not about you. It's not your value. Your money is not being invested in a way that provides value back to the whole state. So that, I think, also helps to address sexism in the arts, because it's about the output and it's about what people see on screen or on stage. And once again, it also goes to redistribution of power. Just to give an example, in the screen sector, as I mentioned, Courtney introduced the target of 50-50 by 2020, and it's 50-50 key creatives. In television, reporting at the end of last year showed that it was largely there, but that doesn't mean that the problem is fixed, right? So I play a game with my kids all the time, which is count the extras, and they're mostly blokes, and they're mostly white. But you have to start somewhere, and getting key creatives in place who are not mostly blokes and mostly white leads to a conversation about, well, what is our audience and how can we attract a broader audience and how can we better reflect the members of our community? So we set targets. They're not quotas, they're targets, but they've been very effective because they've been a means of having a conversation about what you are doing through your creative process, who you have on board, and how you are going to skill up your organisation to better reflect our community and society in the future. So placements has been one example, but we also have quite targeted programs just for women. And in some of those programs, so for example, one we ran one year, it was emerging artists, emerging filmmakers, and the next year was emerging filmmakers for women. It was like 100% more take-up, and all of those women could have applied to the first round, but they didn't, because the message wasn't there that this is something specifically for you. So just messaging really helped the take-up, and getting those people some experience in the sector also helps overall with the makeup of those particular companies. For us, it also means that it opens up an opportunity to have conversations. So, and we do this all the time as an agency. Organisations come to us to talk about their project, about funding, about who they could get in touch with to make it happen. And the first port of call is, that's a great list of projects you've brought to the table or productions, but I noticed that all of the key creatives are men. Go away and introduce some diversity into your key creative list and come back and talk to us again. And the reception has been really good. Like, they do. They go away and they work harder to come back with a more diverse key creative list. The second part of targets, I think, is for us about reporting. So if a target approach is not working, then you start to call it out. And for us, that's reporting on the gender mix in a particular part of the sector that we fund, but we could do that more broadly. And we do. I've been talking a lot about screen, but we could do more of that in the arts sector. It's a slightly different approach. It's not as much a project-based approach to funding as it is program-based, but nonetheless, you can set targets and then start reporting on that, and that's something we're quite keen to do next year. And I think finally, I'd just like to say, I think that for us, like I say, sit down with the kids and we watch TV and we play Count the Extra. I'm not pretending that these things are solutions. They're part of the way to changing a conversation, part of the way to opening up more opportunity for people, particularly for women in the screen and art sectors, part of a way for opening up a conversation about what are the systemic problems, where does the power lie and why does it lie there? And it's giving us as an agency some tools to work with the sector to try and address those problems. I think we've had In particular, we have had screen sector come to us in the past and push back about why are you intervening in our marketplace? Not so much anymore. A lot of those guys have come along, but my response has always been, of course we intervene, because if we didn't intervene in the marketplace, you wouldn't get funding in the first place. So now we're intervening for other reasons, and those reasons are about addressing imbalance in the workplace, and your workplace happens to be arts and screen. So for us as a starting point, it is really about encouraging diversity to break down the power structures so that then we're developing opportunity, and through that opportunity changing what happens to be the bedrock of the industry slowly over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker, Amrita, is a dancer and a choreographer working in the field of experimental dance. Her choreography is rooted in creating movement in transitional spaces, interweaving her rich cultural heritage and contemporary dance training. Amrita has trained at Nasda Dance College in New South Wales and the Alvin Ailey American Dance School in New York. She has exhibited and performed at the Sydney Opera House, Next Wave Festival, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, Carriage Works, Sydney, TEDx Sydney, and the Banff Centre in Alberta, Canada. She's also just back from Brisbane, where I personally saw her take the Australian performing arts market by storm. Please welcome Amrita Heppy.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin, as I always do, when speaking in front of a big audience, just acknowledging that we are standing on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I usually follow this up by saying a little bit about the people and the place. So one of my favourite historical figures from this country is the one and only Barangaroo, Bennelong's first wife, and Barangaroo, Bennelong was her second husband. All she ever wore, even at the governor's table, was a slim bone through her septum, and on a special occasion to visit the governor, white ochre. When invited to watch a flogging, she became disgusted and furious and tried to wrest the whip from the flogger's hand. An excellent fisher, she fought passionately, furiously, and for the most part, independently against assimilation, sexism, and racism before these terms ever became what they are and what we are discussing this evening. So my name is Amrita Heppy, and I'm a dancer and choreographer based in Gadigal country. I'm a Bundjalung woman from northern New South Wales, so specifically Lismore, and a Ngāpuhi woman from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My iwi rests kind of Mount Maunganui way. I make dance work that takes place in theatres, other times is large scale and site specific, and have been working a lot in white spaces, galleries. I'm interested in making work that pushes the barriers of intersectionality, garners access points for tricky subjects, and sparks curiosity. My work always begins with using the body as an archive and as a springboard. So when I was asked to do this talk, or to do these provocations, I actually started on a bigger topic, which was the intersections of sexism with racism and all these other tricky things, and I quickly realised that that's actually quite a lot to take on board. So I thought I'd actually talk a little bit about something that's quite close to me and something that I've spoken about before here at the Opera House, which is, I guess, the corporeal nature of sexism and shame in the body, which, being a dancer, is something that I actually think I can talk to, because I know that there's a lot of things out there that we're hearing again and again that aren't new. I've spoken quite openly about shame in the body and how for a while there I changed direction and even stopped dancing because of the dichotomy of the gaze and what I had made it and my body mean. Once I began developing into a woman and not a girl, how the currency changed and how the movement was different and layered, and how it went from cute to too much, and actually how I stopped dancing because I didn't want to acknowledge or draw attention to my body. I didn't want to garner unwanted positive or negative commentary. I didn't want any commentary. And I feel that this actually touches on a little bit of what you were saying about dimming this spark in order to get through. I didn't want to dance anymore. And it was so weird because it was an instrument for bringing me such great joy. I notice still now in times where I switch codes, I dim myself, or I become more terse than is natural in order to not get attacked, to go unnoticed, or to get through. There's a lot of power, I think, in visibility, but sometimes also too there can be power in invisibility and being able to just shift through a space. For example, as well, we have a lot of layered relationships with our body, and I know that when I've taught people dance that aren't dancers in nightclubs or in different arenas, I will begin by asking people to touch their chest or their hips. And the various amounts of censoring that happen there is curious. When I ask people to touch their chest, it's almost as if it's not connected to them or anywhere near their hips. How has it come to that? I guess that would be my first provocation. To be honest, when I was writing this talk, it also really stumped me. Please forgive me for this confession, but my first thought was, sexism is boring, talking about it is boring, we know it's happening, we've seen what's going on, and, what's now? And I definitely don't have any answers, as we have all confessed over and over again on this panel. And I think that there's a lot of slippery slopes to it all. After the overwhelming response from Me Too and the Harvey Weinstein incident, my initial response wasn't shock, reading the streams and streams of stories, and which some would argue that it's been so normalised that I wouldn't find these stories shocking. The stories were unpleasant, gross, prickly, sad, demeaning, but they weren't surprising. It's happened to my mother, my mother's mother, my mother's mother, and to me. My second thought, and I want to put this provocation to the room, is how many times do we need to hear about what we know is going on in order to believe it? How much trauma do we need to endure and to relive in order for you to believe us? Victims of sexism and abuse don't owe you their survival stories. However, I do acknowledge the catalyst this has caused for change and recognition by bringing them out into the open. So then how do we continue to talk about it without dredging up a lot of emotional heartache? When addressing also sexism, I think it's far too easy to peg this on anyone. To do that would be, very easy, and to do that wouldn't address this problem fairly, because sexism is about more than its casualties and its victims, celebrity and otherwise. It's about power, as we've all acknowledged, the slippery slopes of desire, and about behaviour. And as corny as it sounds, we are all in it together. I have to acknowledge that a version of me would have pegged this on men and the patriarchy, but actually systems of power aren't upheld solely by people who misuse power. They are also upheld by those who are scared, those who don't want to be involved, those who have a million other things to worry about, or who haven't been affected by sexism, or so they think. So why should they care? To this, we could say you are complicit, you are involved, but then it goes into shifting the blame around. Interestingly, in 2017, complicit was Dictionary.com's word of the year, seeing a spike of 10,000% Google rate after the election of Trump. I think to address this, to take accountability beyond victim and perpetrator, and to really take on the breadth of this issue, is to see that we're complicit in both, within organisations but also within individual circumstances. And that's where it gets tricky. A lot of the time, I think we expect our victims to be so traumatised that they can't go on. They need to have visual signs that they can't cope. But to be honest, I just don't think this is true. I don't think it's necessarily that we need to see somebody that is so traumatised by sexism that they can't go on, while I do acknowledge that this is also too a scenario that happens. Sometimes there are no signs, there is no cry for help, there is no dramatic climax, and there is no hashtag. It goes on and on, unacknowledged or unbelieved, because we expect people to deal with things between themselves and without making a mess or a fuss. We don't know how to keep on talking to each other when things get difficult or emotional, so we don't. And when we do, we either shut each other off from being able to resolve things or leave them open and festering. To be clear, stories of sexism aren't always as salacious or clear as Weinstein, with one big monster at the head. Sometimes they are small, they are working class, and they are just as problematic. And what about when someone is accused of sexism? What next? After we light our pitchforks and set them on fire, what happens after the barbecue? Here's the thing, I don't expect a rational or clear answer from anyone on this, victims, complicit or otherwise. How can we when there is so much to lose and so much to protect? I think beyond Weinstein, the most polarising story I'd read was about Aziz Ansari. For those of us who aren't up to speed, there was a website called Babe that published a messy but tell-all article about a date that happened between Ansari and a young photographer. What I got from this was, I've definitely been on that date before. And maybe it wasn't the worst night of my life. Aziz and heaps of people don't know how to talk about what they want in sex, and this does not excuse them. And so make bold and stupid assumptions. But beyond that, I think while sexism and sex aren't necessarily and always related, because it does come back to power, and this is not anything that I ever thought that I would talk about at the Opera House in my professional or career life, here goes. Sex and intimacy is having our deepest desires acknowledged with someone as a port of trust. All the shit that we never thought we'd be able to share with someone is acknowledged, and it's exciting, whether physical or otherwise, corporeal or otherwise. It's one of the many ways that we communicate things. And sometimes for the sake of not wanting to ruin a mood, or actually I think sometimes because we don't know how to communicate with each other beyond words, and within a corporeal sense, we don't ask. I think it's a human crisis that we can't read each other. And I think while dancers definitely don't always get it right, there is definitely a listening that I feel happens within the studio that I feel very blessed to be a part of. So, yeah, these are my many, many provocations and rantings for you this evening. Thank you very much.
Wow. What a lineup of speakers, my goodness. So our final speaker this evening is Liz Duck-Chong, writer, photographer, musician, pun aficionado, podcaster, occasional filmmaker, bumblebee enthusiast and ex-roadie. Liz's poetry, prose, essays and opinions have been published widely in places including the Sydney Morning Herald, Crikey, Kill Your Darlings, Archer, the ABC, SBS, Overland, Rabbit Magazine, Gravel Mag, Junkie, Story Seed and Moon Sick. Liz is an incredible and vital voice in our cultural landscape and has spoken at Queer Stories, SAMAG, TEDx, and tonight has made time to join us here at the Sydney Opera House. Please welcome our final speaker of the night, Liz Duck-Chong.
Hi. I just want to acknowledge that this conversation is very full of women, but I really appreciate being part of this conversation as both a queer woman and a trans woman. I think that's a really important thing. So a few years ago, a friend of mine down in Melbourne was asked by an ex-girlfriend to catch up over coffee. The meeting started tersely, and she seemed to struggle to find words. "Hey," she said, "I've been thinking back on our relationship, and I realised that some stuff happened. You did some stuff that was really not okay. Some stuff that was abusive." They talked a little more, and she left shortly afterwards, leaving in her wake a list of requests: that he start seeing a therapist, that he avoid the local art scene they were both members of for a while, and that he not talk to her again. He did so, starting therapy and stepping back from his community for several years. Yet is it at this point that he started to face stronger and stronger call-outs from this ex and her peers. I come into this story here, hearing about it through a phone tree of friends, and upon realising his current partner and I have met a number of times and are on good terms, I inquire about the situation. A clear set of parameters were asked of him by this ex as a result of the harm he committed, a set of parameters he worked to meet. An escalated state of calling out was entered into, and the ongoing conflict saw no immediate end as a result. This woman's unresolved tension and her need to find control and peace through continuing to engage with her experience are still a cause of pain, and they are both clearly at a loss of what to do next. The right of victims to choose the way in which they heal is imperative and something I believe in, along with the power in dictating those ways to those around them. But I also struggle to see how we can heal as individuals and as a community when there is a vacuum of resolution. I see people trying to engage the state through policing and sentencing to find answers and solutions to trauma that is highly personal, but often exacerbated by that same state. It is in this space void of answers that I spent the past year or more stuck and searching for solutions, for options, for resolutions. I guess it is this search and the many people engaging with it that has led us all here tonight. Hashtag #MeToo, or the Me Too movement, has swept through the arts industry around the world, the internet, as a conduit for pointing out and naming our pain, inarguably powerful. In light of this event, however, and the questions we are posing, I want to take a moment to ask what the movement has and has not achieved. It is my belief that the Me Too movement has achieved two distinct outcomes. The first is that in the loudness, many have been able to find communities of support and find belief in our own experiences. The second is unequivocally demonstrating that there are abusers in our midst. The range and superabundance of stories confirms what many of us have known for years, whether through whisper networks or first-hand trauma, that no industry or space is inherently safer, not for being more educated, higher or lower earning, more or less casual, having a certain political leaning. Unfortunately, there is far more that the Me Too movement has failed to do. Despite the deafening online outpouring of our darkest moments, there remain many unasked and unanswered questions. A disengagement of our responsibility to each other as more than just passive listeners or active agents of anger, an absence of community accountability, and a concerning focus on punishment and retribution. From what became an ever-increasing number of variations on the theme, there remained an overwhelming sense of core issues that not only enacted the harm in the first place, but continued it in perpetuity. Patriarchy, entitlement, and power, to name a few. Little was as clear as so many of us having baggage who have just not found the right terminal to check yet. At the time, and looking back, I'm also stuck that in this brand new world of chronicled hurt, there seemed to be so little room to talk about healing and who enables and enacts it. Another friend of mine, a woman who was abused by a man some years ago and going through every channel a good victim is supposed to go through, had him expelled from her university. And she spoke to me recently of her regret about this. Her immediate impulse was to use the institutional power available to her to shun him entirely, but in hindsight has realised that a man who violently believed the system was against him was simply uprooted into a different city, a different university, and a different pool of women. Instead of feeling healed, she instead compulsively checks what he is up to, frets over his potential new victims, and relives her own trauma. In the afterword of her 2016 book called Conflict is Not Abuse, that deals with, among other topics, harm reduction through community, Sarah Schulman recounts a question she was asked on a college stage, similar to the situation my friend found herself in, of when a victim expressed anger that her rapist had not been expelled from the school. And she writes, "I propose that expelling a man who has committed sexual assault from an elite private school simply unleashes him on the world of women who don't go to elite private schools. It may remove him from the class-based gated community, but it launches an angry, disenfranchised and stigmatised perpetrator into the world of women who don't have deans and college councils to defend them." Well, I think that we can take something away from this tonight when we loosely sub in words like CEOs, managers and creative directors with deans and arts organisations and funding bodies with private schools. I consider the biggest takeaway from this is her belief, and indeed my belief, that not only is it the members of communities with institutional support and backing who are best equipped to initiate a process of healing, but that a process of healing is not only possible, but essential. It begs the question, what does this look like? Restorative justice is a term for a process of community accountability. Traditionally employed in activist and grassroots circles, it aims to repair the harm caused by crime by bringing together victims, community members, and offenders to decide what harm repair looks like for them in that circumstance. What this structure looks like differs greatly depending on the type of organisation, the harm perpetrated, the community in question, and the funds available. There's a difficult balance here too. When trying to create a system that does not allow abusers to slip through the cracks unseen, but simultaneously recognises that they are humans who must be able to atone and become better people, we have to engage with a model of penance and penalty that doesn't simply write someone off or demand they recuse themselves from engaging in the world forever. We're not helped by complicating factors and realities we have to contend with in this work, such as that some people report assault immediately, some people take a short or long while, and some people never report it. That perpetrators of assault are in the majority men, but not all perpetrators are, and that men can also be victims of assault. And that many people who report assault, and that many people who report assault are doing so because they were assaulted, that some do because they assaulted someone and want to exist outside accountability, and some do so when no assault occurred because they feel harmed in a way that they are otherwise unable to name or seek compassion for. The Me Too movement helped focus a lens on a specific and rife form of assault that occurs in industries all around us, but our solutions to that problem need to also function once we move outside of situations of patriarchal and heterosexual power. In the chapter Taking Risks, Implementing Grassroots Community Accountability Strategies, it's quite a mouthful, from the zine The Revolution Starts at Home, a framework is laid out for how to consider the harm that is done inside of communities and how those communities engage in accountability and healing. Among the 10 guidelines they expand upon are, for example, to recognise everybody involved's humanity and to prioritise the self-determination of the survivor, but also to be clear and specific about what kinds of accountability the group engaging in a resolution process want from the aggressor, and to communicate this clearly with the aggressor and those around them. It states, "It is important to make sure that accountability is not simply an elusive concept that folks in the group are ultimately unclear about. Does accountability mean counselling for the aggressor, an admission of guilt, a public or a private apology, or is it specific behavioural changes?" This chapter talks of a revolution through healing, but it points out that this is often work that involves the time and energy of both ourselves and our communities. I recommend seeking out the whole zine later on. I also want to emphasise my belief that any resolution and action we come to will be found through compassion first and foremost, which is often sorely missing in a lot of these conversations. In tonight's setting, I believe we have slightly more ability and slightly more responsibility, seeing as many of these grassroots groups don't have management bodies and HR departments. But that doesn't undermine the amount of work that still needs to be done, and it's clearly evidenced by the Me Too movement and all its continuing offshoots. It's a difficult issue, as many of us have said tonight, and one that intrinsically is so personal to many of us. I myself have been on every side of a call-out and experienced a great deal of the emotions associated with those. And yet none of them have felt like closure or like answers. And I do not believe the current paths these movements are treading actually have answers at their end. I think we need new ones. In truth, I too do not yet have good answers to many of the questions that I have posed, but I'm actually excited to be a part of this ongoing conversation for those of you that are here and watching at home, and for spaces like this, which I think can actually really do some good. Well, I hope so. Thank you.
Just want to take copies of all of these speeches home and read them again. Incredible. Okay, so now is the time for the interactive portion of the evening. But before we do, we need to say goodbye to our Facebook audience, because I'm sure you don't want to see us writing on butcher's paper. It's not as interesting. But if you have joined us online, thank you so much. And check the SAMAG website in the coming days, because the results of what we're about to create in this room will be shared through the SAMAG website.